Roswell, New Mexico, a quiet community in the western desert until the night of July 2nd, 1947. Witnesses say they heard strange sounds and saw a flying saucer crash.
And there was 4 beings laying on the ground, 3 to 4 feet high.
The military took control of the area.
They gathered the craft, they gathered the bodies.
And at a press conference said it was just a weather balloon. But many say that the weather balloon story was an attempt to cover up a crash of a vehicle from another planet. What really happened that night? The secret of Roswell in this chapter of UFO Diaries. One of the most intriguing chapters in the stories of the UFO Diaries is the one often referred to as the Roswell incident. For almost 50 years, researchers have been unable to get to the truth of the matter. Did a flying saucer, some kind of unearthly spacecraft, crash near Roswell, New Mexico, early in July of 1947? Has the U.S. government recovered it and kept it hidden all these years? And what of the occupants, if any? What happened to them? Does the U.S. government really know what fell from the sky that night? And if they do, will they admit it? And why, after 50 years, do UFO researchers still say it's crucial that we learn the truth? Captain Kevin Randall has committed years of his life to the task of discovering this truth and has written several exhaustive studies on the events at Roswell. As an enduring mystery should, it all began on a stormy night in the summer of 1947.
The story that's been told is that Mac Brazel was alone at the ranch in early July 1947, heard a clap of thunder that sounded much louder, different than the normal claps of thunder. Didn't think too much of it that night. The next day he was out on the range looking to see which fields had gotten the rain the night before because he was going to move the livestock, and as he explored the fields he came to an area that was filled with metallic debris.
Captain Randall and many others have said that the pieces of debris that Mac Brazel discovered were like nothing else on Earth. Mac Brazel then decided to bring the matter to the attention of the authorities. So he left the ranch and drove the few miles into the nearest town, Roswell, New Mexico. The sheriff of Roswell at the time was George Wilcox. His granddaughter, Barbara Duggar, recalls the story.
In the 40s, there was a spacecraft, a flying saucer is what Big Mom called it, crashed outside of Roswell. My grandfather went out there to the site. When he got out there, there was a big burned area, and then they saw debris. I asked her, I said, did he see any little space beings? And she said, yes, there was 4 of them.
The sheriff, according to reports, immediately got in touch with the nearby Army Air Base about the field of strange debris. It was only a short time before officers were on the site and eager to see exactly what Sheriff Wilcox was talking about. After all, a field full of debris is one thing, but actual beings from outer space? What happened next was either the biggest error or the biggest cover-up in the history of the Air Force.
Major Jesse A. Marcel, the air intelligence officer of the 509th Bomb Group, was told by Colonel Blanchard to go out and take a look at the scene himself. Marcel got out there, again, saw an area that he described himself as 3/4 of a mile long, 200 to 300 feet wide, filled with metallic debris. He showed it to Colonel William Blanchard, the commander of the 509th Bomb Group. Blanchard ordered a press release saying that the Army had captured a flying saucer, talked to Lieutenant Walter Hott. Hott issued the press release, wrote the press release, and took it to the various media outlets in Roswell, the 2 radio stations, the 2 newspapers, and from that point it went over the wire.
The release read, in part, the many rumors regarding the flying disc became a reality yesterday when the intelligence office of the 509th Bomb Group of the 8th Air Force, Roswell Army Airfield, was fortunate enough to gain possession of a disc through the cooperation of one of the local ranchers. But there was no mention of the space beings the sheriff told his family he had seen. Was this the beginning of a giant hoax or a giant cover-up? Barbara Duggar's grandmother was still afraid of the repercussions 40 years after the event.
Anybody to tell it. She said, the reason I'm telling you this is because when the incident happened, the military police came to the courthouse. They told George and I that if we ever told anything about this incident, talked about it in any way, that not only we would be killed, but the family, that they would get the rest of the family.
But if the Air Force had already admitted publicly that they had in their possession a flying saucer, why threaten a local official and his family if they didn't keep silent? And according to Bill Brazel, Mac's son, his father was also sworn to secrecy. Secrecy about what? Had Mac Brazel found something more than just a field littered with strange debris?
This is basically the point where the Roswell incident becomes a whole series of different mysteries, and they kind of crisscross one another. Because if Colonel Blanchard admitted they had a more or less intact flying saucer, then clearly somewhere they had more than just the small bits of metallic debris reported by Mac Brazel.
According to many who were in Roswell at the time, the result was a tremendous flood of worldwide attention focused on the small New Mexico town. But what happened next seems to have been even more mysterious.
3 hours later, the official story changed. General Roger Ramey, commander of the 8th Air Force, the parent organization of the 509th Bomb Group, issued another press release saying it was nothing more than a weather balloon. According to General Ramey, the balloon had crashed on the ranch. That's what Major Marcel found. He had overreacted thinking that he had a flying saucer. It was just this weather balloon and the Raywin target reflector.
Is it possible that this photograph was a total fabrication? Here's what the officer on the right, General Thomas Dubose, now says about this Army Air Force press release claiming the crash was just a weather balloon.
We knew that it was a cover story, and whose idea it was, I haven't the vaguest idea, but we used that in order to assuage the curiosity of the press.
Why? Why would representatives of the U.S. military announce that the debris was from a weather balloon if senior officers knew otherwise?
Maybe Mac Brazel did find a balloon, but the problem with this is it never explains all the other testimony. It does not explain all the debris.
Recently, Major Marcel's son has come forward to tell an amazing story he remembers from his childhood having to do with that same debris.
Major Marcel brought some of the material home so they could show it to his wife and his son. Then later on, he took all of that material back to the Roswell Army Airfield.
Found this stuff scattered all over the countryside.
The thing that set this apart from anything that I'd ever seen before or since was the markings on parts of the wreckage. In the I-beam structural members, there was like a writing of sorts. I remember at the time thinking this was like hieroglyphic, but it wasn't really hieroglyphic, but it was more of geometrical forms and symbols.
What has kept the Roswell incident a matter of heated controversy, even today? One reason is the story told by this man, Grady Barnett, a civil engineer living in Roswell at the time. Grady Barnett told his friend Vern Malte about what he saw that July afternoon.
Mr. Barnett told me that when he was coming back from one of his field trips, he'd run onto a flying saucer that had burst open, and there were 4 beings on the ground.
4 alien beings, as well as an almost intact spacecraft. The number of beings coincides exactly with what Sheriff George Wilcox said he found.
Civil engineer Grady Barnett claims to have seen a crashed flying saucer and the dead occupants of that craft. Can this be the same craft that the Army Air Force later claimed to have in its possession?
But if Grady Barnett's flying saucer was almost entirely intact, what accounts for the massive amounts of debris discovered by Mac Brazel? And there was something else. Barnett said all the beings he saw were dead. Sheriff Wilcox told a slightly different story.
And Granddaddy said their heads were large, and the little suit that they had on was just, you couldn't, it was just like silk or something. And I asked her, I said, were the little men alive? Were they dead? And she said, I think one of them was alive.
Could it be there were 2 flying saucers instead of just 1, each carrying a crew of 4? Some UFO researchers believe that this is the only explanation. By all accounts, the debris was all very small. If these were pieces of a craft of some kind, it must have been totally obliterated.
Based on first-hand accounts of other people who were involved, it's clear that the solution to the mystery was going to be found miles away from the Brazel Ranch, much closer to Roswell. Since the vessel was made of such super strong material, whatever destroyed it must have been a tremendous force.
And what about the material found at the Mac Brazel Ranch? By all accounts, the debris was clearly not something from this earth.
The material discovered at the debris field defied all attempts of the people to explain what it was. The foil could not be cut. The wood-like material couldn't be whittled. It couldn't be burned. So clearly we have material that is not like anything that was available in our society in 1947.
Is it possible that the pieces of debris found on the ranch were really something quite natural? For example, could they have come from a meteorite?
Well, a meteor would enter the Earth's atmosphere at, of course, very high speed, and once it meets the resistance of the Earth's atmosphere, it begins to burn up and lose, of course, its size. And what's more, a meteor that landed with an audible impact would have left a gigantic impact crater, such as the one in Arizona.
Whatever struck the ground in New Mexico left no crater. It did create a gouge in the terrain, but that's more suggestive of some kind of a controlled crash than something falling out of the sky.
Some have suggested, then, that the debris could easily have been the wreckage from a top-secret spy plane.
During the late 1940s, the former Soviet Union was very curious about American nuclear bomb experiments, which were conducted only 100 miles from Roswell. A spy plane trying to capture these secrets would logically fly to that part of the country.
The Soviet Union had nothing of the kind in 1947. In fact, using Freedom of Information, we checked to see if any Soviet aircraft had penetrated the coastal defense zones in 1947. Absolutely no evidence of any Soviet attempts to fly any kind of aircraft inside the United States in that time frame.
But UFO researchers have recently discovered that the Soviet Union did have an interest in Roswell. George Knapp recently returned from a trip to the former Soviet Union. He discovered that the Russians had a very high level of interest in the events of Roswell in 1947, and they came to some startling conclusions.
We met a scientist while we were in Russia who worked under a guy named Sergei Korolev, who's the father of Russian rocketry. And Korolev had told this doctor about his meeting with Joseph Stalin in the late 1940s. Stalin had an intense interest in UFOs, and one of the things he wanted to know about was Roswell. At the time, the late 40s, Roswell, New Mexico, was a hotbed of Russian espionage activity because we had so many secret military programs there. So they heard about Roswell, and they were curious about it. And he had his scientists and his spies study it, and the conclusion they came up with was that Roswell was real, that something really did crash there, that it wasn't a weather balloon, and it wasn't anything of earthly origin. They didn't know exactly where it came from, but they knew it wasn't ours and it wasn't theirs, and this was something that was of monumental importance that needed to be studied.
Still, at the center of this story was the man who had, in a sense, started it all, Mac Brazel.
Brazel was a virtual prisoner at the ranch. If this is true, then it would seem the Army feared he might tell others the truth about what he'd seen. Then, another unexpected development in the Roswell incident.
Come on over and take a look at this. It'll be all right. It'll be okay. Come on over. Come here. There he goes! Hey! Get him! Where'd he go? Where'd he go? Over there. This way, there. This way.
The story of the Roswell incident took a remarkable turn when, as witnesses claim, Mac Brazel escaped from the Army and headed straight for the people he knew he could trust.
His friends at radio station KGFL in Roswell would later tell how they hid Brazel at one of their houses.
We offered him a place to stay that night so he could get away from a lot of people with questions.
The plan had been to broadcast an interview with Mac Brazel, but Judd Roberts tells us that he'd gotten a number of phone calls from Washington, D.C. that prevented them from broadcasting the interview.
A suggestion was made to us that if we wanted to keep our license, we would not use the interview on the air because that would give us about 24 hours to find something else to do beside the radio business.
Can this really be true? Did the U.S. Army use coercive tactics to ensure Mac Brazel's silence? And if so, his silence about what?
But while at the base, he was virtually a prisoner. We know that he was kept at the guest house under guard, which is not exactly being in jail, but it's basically the same thing. On the evening of July 9th, the military took Mac Brazel to the various media outlets in Roswell, and here he was telling them a story that differed significantly than what he had told them on July 6th.
What I found yesterday in my field was a weather balloon.
What?
A weather balloon.
What are you talking
What happened to Mac Brazel during the time he was in custody? Why did he change his story?
Perhaps the truth is that Mac Brazel planned to reveal the same remarkable story later told by mortician Glenn Dennis.
In 1947, Glenn Dennis worked at the Ballard Funeral Home. In small towns, often the hearse doubled as an ambulance, and Glenn Dennis would have an opportunity to drive injured airmen back out to the base. Once he arrived at the hospital and escorted the airmen into the emergency room, he had an opportunity to see some of the metallic debris that had been collected on the debris field in the back of ambulances as he walked by them.
Looks like you've had a crash. I said, I see some debris, and then the ambulance is there. And that's probably where I really got in trouble, right there.
Excuse me, sir. This is private property. No looking.
Hey. You know, what do you guys got there?
Don't you worry about what we got there.
You say one word to anybody, and you're dead. Get him out of here.
Glenn was told in very blunt language that if he ever talked about this, if he went into town and told his friends about it, he'd be killed.
But Glenn Dennis's connection to the Roswell incident did not end there. He would soon learn much more from his girlfriend, a nurse at the base hospital.
And this was a young second lieutenant, a very deeply religious lady. She was born and raised in a very strict Catholic family. She was going into this examination room that was across the hall. She was going in to get some supplies, and when she walked in the door, there was two doctors there. She started out the door and said, "You stay here, we've got to have you." And what it was, they were examining, she told me, 3 bodies, foreign bodies. She said 2 of them were very mutilated. That was then, she said, "I've got to go back to the barracks." He said, "I am deathly ill and I've got to go back to the barracks." And then that was the last time I ever saw her. The next day, I called out. I wanted to see how she was doing and how she was feeling. And they said that she'd been transferred out. And they didn't know where, but she was no longer there at the air base.
What happened to the nurse who was pressed into duty on that fateful July day? Did she see, perhaps even work on, the bodies described by Sheriff Wilcox?
Could this really have happened? And if so, are the bodies even related at all to the debris found by Mac Brazel? If this is the real solution to the Roswell mystery at last, it unfortunately only raises other equally difficult questions. If there were 2 saucers, or one that broke into 2 pieces, where are all of those pieces now? And if the alien pilots really were taken away from the crash site, what became of them?
Sappho Henderson, the widow of an Air Force pilot flying out of Roswell at the time, claims to have the answer.
I guess if they're putting in the papers now, it's no longer a top secret. And he said, he bought the papers, and we went to the car, and he said, "Read those." And I read the article, and he said, "It's a true story." He said, "Not only did I know about it, but I'm the pilot that took the crashed saucer to Dayton, Ohio."
Was undeniable proof of extraterrestrial life carefully transported to Dayton, Ohio, and hidden away?
Even if it were possible to piece together the truth about the Roswell incident, can we somehow prove once and for all what really happened? Or has the evidence been locked away where the general public could never find it?
We know enough about what happened to realize the government collected everything. They policed the area, they gathered the craft, they gathered the bodies. They picked up everything. Best evidence is that the spacecraft and the bodies were collected in Hangar 84 at the Roswell Army Airfield, and that they were then sent to other bases around the country. We know, based on, again, good testimony, that a preliminary autopsy was held at the base hospital. The nurse that Glenn Dennis knew said that she saw 3 bodies inside the base hospital. So we know 3 of them were at the hospital at one time. What we have are a large number of people many of whom are unknown to one another, telling the same basic story from different points of view, from Mac Brazel on the debris field to the men such as Major Edwin Easley, who was on the impact site, telling a story that dovetails nicely. If it was a hoax, we would not have the corroborative testimony that has been offered by these people.
The Roswell incident seems to be a mystery that will never fully be explained unless more of the original eyewitnesses break the decades of silence. It does seem there's been an elaborate cover-up, lasting almost half a century and employing methods that may have at times been brutal. But could the wall of silence around the Roswell incident finally be breaking down? Will the government soon release the whole truth, exactly as it happened?
After numerous requests from his constituents, New Mexico Congressman Steve Schiff has asked the U.S. Department of Defense for an official explanation of the events of July 1947.
In March of 1993, New Mexico Congressman Stephen Schiff began an attempt to break through the wall of secrecy that's been hiding this event.
But he was answered only by an Air Force colonel who claimed that the Department of Defense keeps its documents from that era on file in the National Archives, and that Congressman Schiff should contact them. A search of the archives only produced another mystery.
Congressman Schiff eventually got a response from the National Archives, which said generally that they had no information in the archives about the events now known as the Roswell incident.
Apparently, in the eyes of the Defense Department, the Roswell incident simply did not happen. Why are there no records of what numerous witnesses claimed they saw? A military operation carried out on private property.
The Blue Book files contain absolutely no information about Roswell with the exception of a single paragraph and a single newspaper clipping in another file. So Congressman Schiff felt that response from the military, from the National Archives, did not answer the questions he had asked.
But what of the threats, the intimidation, the secrecy? Are we to believe, as the government still seems to expect, that it was all over a weather balloon?
For those who claim to have been eyewitnesses to whatever happened at Roswell, the events of July 1947 can never be forgotten. But until more evidence comes to the surface, the incident at Roswell is still another of the many unanswered questions in the UFO Diaries.
In December of 1965, residents of Kecksburg, Pennsylvania, not only saw, but actually found what many claim was a vehicle from outer space. The object was clearly seen not just falling, but appearing to land in the woods nearby. Within 2 hours, armed military forces of the U.S. government literally invaded this small Pennsylvania town, retrieved the object, and hauled it away. What was it that fell or landed near Kecksburg, Pennsylvania? Does the U.S. government have an authentic UFO in its possession? We'll attempt to discover the truth in this chapter of UFO Diaries.
For 30 years, Kecksburg, Pennsylvania has been a town divided by a bizarre controversy. Many of its citizens claiming that nothing out of the ordinary has ever happened there, while other residents claim that in December 1965, this Westmoreland County village was briefly the home of a crashed UFO.
What is the truth about this strange metal object that witnesses say crashed in the woods near Kecksburg? And why do some of them say the local people were ordered to keep quiet about what happened? Was it because they'd stumbled across some top-secret government project? Or because they'd seen an object that proved the existence of intelligent life on other planets? To learn the truth, we must return to that December afternoon in 1965.
It was approximately 4:47 p.m. when the object impacted in the woods at Kecksburg. There are a number of local residents around Kecksburg who saw the object get down into the wooded area. While none of these people reported any type of sound of impact, almost momentarily there was a column of blue smoke that rose up out of the woods.
According to the eyewitness accounts, Kecksburg residents soon rushed to the spot where they now saw smoke rising through the trees. There, they say, they discovered a metallic object partially buried at the bottom of a ravine, still smoking from its long descent through the Earth's atmosphere. Kecksburg resident Jim Romansky says he was one of the first to locate the object at the bottom of a densely wooded ravine.
Here was this large metal object in front of me. I've described it as a large acorn. And the reason I say the acorn is because around the bottom of this object there was a bumper that went the whole way around this thing. It was dented and it had a very distinct color. I mean, this thing was a bronze, copper, steel. It was a color that it's very hard even to describe.
Then, according to Romansky and many other witnesses, armed U.S. soldiers arrived with trucks and other heavy equipment.
You know, the military started coming in. We were under martial law, jeeps, trucks everywhere.
Down through the woods come two guys. Trench coats, crew-cut hair, straight as ramrods. He looked around, he looked at the object, he looked at us, and a very authoritative voice told us that this area is now quarantined, it's restricted, to get out.
According to Romansky and many other witnesses interviewed by Stan Gordon, the object only remained in the ravine for a few hours because the soldiers who had so quickly arrived on the scene then recovered the object and took it somewhere else.
Here comes this big flatbed truck, tractor trailer, two-piece truck. And on the back of it, it either had either a tow motor, one of those things you lift things with, or a front loader. The back of this flatbed, they had this big tarp on it, and it was stretched down around this object. And it had the same outline. In fact, I know I could see the bumper under this tarp because you could see the shape of this thing. The tarp was pulled so tight that you could see the shape. And I knew in my mind that was what they brought down off that mountain, the object.
The military truck with the flatbed trailer with the object on it departed late that evening from Kecksburg. And from information we now have, the truck continued on and it went to Lockbourne Air Force Base in Columbus, Ohio, where it stayed over for a short period of time. From there, it went over to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. It seems very likely that our government had tracked the object and they had notified the quick response recovery teams that are involved in this type of operation.
But since the object was apparently taken away, never to be seen again, it might seem that as far as the residents of Kecksburg were concerned, the incident was over. But according to a number of the eyewitnesses, the most terrifying aspect of their encounter with a UFO had really only just begun.
John Murphy, who was the news director of WHJB, felt that the story concerning the object at Kecksburg was of great importance. So he did a lot of investigation on the case and interviewed a number of witnesses who had been involved or had knowledge about the incident.
What exactly did you see?
Well, I saw there was an object falling and it was burning.
Is that exactly what you saw?
Yeah, it was in the shape of an acorn. It was falling from the sky on fire, and it came down very smoothly and then landed in the woods. And it had some sort of writing of some sort. We couldn't figure out what it was.
Writing? Are you sure it wasn't like Japanese writing or something?
No.
Or Chinese?
Nothing I've ever seen.
Nothing. Very different.
Are you sure this is, you're saying it's a spaceship now, not anything that...
Yeah,
Absolutely.
It was very bright.
Absolutely.
So what is the situation here on the home front around here with all the soldiers?
We don't know what's happening, so it's very frightening.
According to the witness account, something seems to have badly frightened a good many of those who had seen the unidentified flying object and who had witnessed its recovery by the military.
This is John Murphy. We're going to cut for a quick commercial break. Hello, this is John.
Hi, John.
Hey, Sally, how are you doing? That was a great interview yesterday. You and your son did a good job.
Well, you can't air that.
Why?
Because I made a big mistake.
Oh, hold on.
It's not the right story.
What?
Well, people make mistakes, and I was wrong. Thanks a lot. Bye.
And we're back.
It seems as though something must have occurred between the time of the interview with John Murphy and the time that the radio special was to be aired, because of the fact that these people were willing to be interviewed and then suddenly they decided they didn't want their name or any information aired with this report.
Why? What happened to cause the witnesses to refuse to make their testimony public after they'd been so willing only hours before?
I think these people knew that something had come down, and the military presence was so strong that night that a lot of people who the military knew, seen something or lived real close to it, was either told to be quiet or were bought out or something.
You guys listen up. What you saw out there in that field, it was nothing. Erase it from your memory, okay? Don't tell your mom, don't tell your dad, don't tell anyone. You got it?
The government does have an official policy on UFOs. They are not vehicles from any other planet. But they do know that some UFO sightings actually are piloted by alien life forms.
What are you doing? What are you doing? This is our town.
So one likely explanation for the behavior of the military at Kecksburg is that they knew they were dealing with a spaceship.
But is there any way to prove that the object in the woods really was something not made by human hands?
How can we learn the real truth about what landed in Kecksburg in December 1965? Is it possible that we are in fact on a wild goose chase, pursuing the truth about an event that never really happened? Many local residents agree that something fell to earth at Kecksburg, but some claim that government soldiers did not hurry to the scene or retrieve an object from the woods.
There has been some debate over the authenticity of the event at Kecksburg, that nothing fell at all in the woods that day, that what was seen was only a meteor.
But Jim Romansky says he has maintained for 30 years that the meteor story was the one given to some Kecksburg locals by the military.
Someone said, hey, what the hell was that up there anyhow? And the guy hollered back, oh, it was a meteorite. And I looked at one guy and we both bust out laughing, because we knew it was no meteorite.
Along with orders to stand by that explanation.
You understand what he's saying? Good. I hope you do. Because if you don't listen, I'll kill you.
With a 30-year-old debate dividing those who were in Kecksburg at the time, is there any way for us to really know the truth about the object that landed in 1965? After all, we don't have the object to examine. But is it possible for us to learn the truth by eliminating the explanations that simply do not fit the facts?
As a researcher of this case and other type of UFO phenomena, it's always our position to try to find a logical explanation for what people see. I think, first of all, we can rule out the fact that the incident in Kecksburg is a hoax. Something did occur there that night that created a lot of activity, and the fact that the military apparently responded in the way they did indicated the fact that this was something that was important to our government and military. The bright fireball object was reported first in Canada, then over a number of states, including Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. So a lot of people did indeed see something.
But does a sighting of a falling, flaming UFO prove that it was some kind of manufactured object? Or might it not simply have just been a meteor?
Meteors are pieces of rock and other debris that burn up by friction in the Earth's atmosphere, and normally moving at a very high rate of speed, thousands of miles per hour. It seems that whatever the object was here, it made several different turns, unlike that of a meteor, which would normally move on a straight path. Those people who observed the object before it impacted indicate the fact that this object was moving very, very slow, almost gliding in, and indicated the fact that even some of the flames around the object could easily be seen individually.
A flaming object that made a controlled landing, a metallic shape without joints or seams, strange markings, unlike anything on Earth, the rapid military deployment. If all these clues are based on fact, do they indeed add up to describe a vehicle from another world?
There are a number of witnesses from around the Kecksburg area that indicate the fact that the military began to arrive in the area probably within about a couple of hours after the impact. The military apparently did not all arrive at the same time, but they periodically began to come into the area, indicating that they may have arrived from different locations. It's highly unlikely that military personnel would quickly respond to the report of a meteorite. This is something that would commonly be done by civilian scientists.
But according to Jim Romansky, the military not only arrived quickly, but immediately took over a central building for their own purposes.
And as we approached the fire hall, I mean, man, you'd have thought there was an invasion going on. I mean, there were jeeps and cars and trucks parked all over the place, all military, okay? And there were uniforms everywhere. And as we tried to approach the door to go back into the fire hall, there was 2 armed sentries or guards, whatever you want to call them, standing there. And they refused us to go in that fire hall. In fact, one of our guys asked to go in and go to the bathroom. And they said, see the weeds over there? Go. It reminded me of some of the war pictures I've seen where these people, military people, come in and declare martial law.
There are numerous documents that indicate the fact that the United States government has had in place for many years a system for handling the recovery of space objects that safely re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. It is very likely that the specialized recovery teams would only have responded if there was something of great importance to the military. This would have been most likely, 1, some type of foreign space device that had landed on our territory and they would like to have studied, or 2, that this may have been something more unusual, such as the possibility of an extraterrestrial spacecraft.
What is the official U.S. military answer to all of this? Do they say that the object recovered at Kecksburg is some top-secret spy satellite that accidentally dropped out of orbit? Or do they admit the possibility that it might be something not of this Earth? Stan Gordon tells of his quest for the answer to that question from the files of the Air Force's 662nd Radar Squadron.
There are indeed records that indicate the fact that there are specially trained intelligence team military personnel that are on call to quickly respond to crashes of space objects that survive re-entry of the Earth's atmosphere. The 662nd Radar Squadron was assigned as a NORAD surveillance site, and Air Force documents verify the fact that at least a few personnel of that squadron were directly involved in the investigation at Kecksburg that night. However, when we look at the historical records for December of that squadron, there's no entry whatsoever of any activity on that day. That leads us to believe that this mission was classified and the paperwork went up the ladder somewhere else. The question is, why, after so many years, is our government still not telling us all the facts it knows about the Kecksburg incident? What is so secret about what they found at that location that even today they refuse to comment about the incident?
It is not disputed that the military gathered up and hauled something away. But what was it? The mystery would take on a new and more surprising twist when reports of a secret Russian satellite suddenly began to surface. Could the episode at Kecksburg be fallout from a failed Russian space launch?
There seem to be only 2 viable explanations for the object that crashed at Kecksburg. Either it was part of a top-secret American or Soviet satellite project, or it was some sort of vehicle from another world.
Remember that by 1965, both the United States and the Soviet Union had the capability of putting nuclear weapons in orbit, and each was desperate to learn about the technology of the other. These rockets had segments that were jettisoned in flight and that fell back toward the Earth, presumably to burn up on re-entry. This practice has continued to the present day, and we now know that sometimes large parts of these space vehicles do not burn up entirely. Occasionally, a rather large fragment will actually reach the ground intact.
There has been a treaty on the books for many years that if something of foreign origin would fall on our soil, we would recover it and give it back to the launching country.
Remember that the American military would have been very interested in recovering a Soviet probe such as Cosmos 96. It would have told a great deal about Russian technology at that time, particularly if there was any reason to believe that the object was part of a Soviet weapons system equipped with nuclear missiles.
But it may be now that after so many years, and the fact that both governments now are on a much more cordial level, the fact that they would rather just overlook the incident and forget about what happened so many years ago.
Could the Kecksburg object have been a Soviet missile system, even a nuclear weapon that accidentally fell to Earth?
Weapon-bearing satellite systems are not designed to make soft landings. If indeed the object that came down in Kecksburg that day was a part of such a weapon system, it first of all would not have made a soft landing, and secondly, most likely there would have been massive destruction in that area.
Cosmos 96 was launched on November 23, 1965, but its booster failed
on the same morning of the Kecksburg incident, and that occurred in Canada. there are indeed some similarities to the shape of the two objects in question.
There was a tiny bit of resemblance, but that's where it stopped.
Was the Kecksburg UFO a failed Soviet Venus probe? If so, does this also explain the strange hieroglyphics seen on the object by more than one witness?
I mean, it was like circles and stars and dashes and all kind of markings on it.
Writing, you sure it wasn't like Japanese writing or something?
No.
Or Chinese?
Nothing I've ever seen.
Nothing.
The external markings or identification markings that we have seen on many of the Soviet probes at the time would look very unusual to people who are not familiar with the Russian language or the type of lettering. And in fact, if the object had re-entered the Earth's atmosphere, there could have been some scarring and burning, and they could have looked somewhat distorted from the re-entry.
My dad is originally from Kiev, and I went to him one time and I said, Dad, I says, you could read and write Polish and Russian. He says, yeah. I said, write me something in both dialects. He says, what? I said, just write me anything. The Polish and Russian writing that I see doesn't come nowhere near it.
And yet the simple fact that Cosmos 96 did fall to Earth on the very same day as the Kecksburg incident is still sufficient evidence for many people to believe that they were one and the same. Then again, according to Stan Gordon, perhaps we shouldn't make up our minds just yet.
We have to look at the possibility that, one, that the object in question may have been man-made, possibly Soviet in origin.
I mean, the Venus probe, you had seams, you had pieces sticking out, you know. It was that quick that I could look at the picture and say, it wasn't it. Because I've been a machinist for almost 30 years now. And I've cut a lot of metal. And I've never run into it again, never.
The object that crashed in the woods at Kecksburg, Pennsylvania, has been the source of controversy and speculation for 3 decades. But are we at last approaching an explanation? There do seem to be many reasons to believe that the fallen Russian space probe, Cosmos 96, was the object seen by so many on that December day in 1965.
Particularly since we know that Cosmos 96 did crash on Earth on that day. But we must still consider several other important facts about Cosmos 96.
The Cosmos Venus probe may have been a lot smaller than what people described at the site of Kecksburg that day. This appeared to be a one-piece structured object. They didn't see any rivets or bolts or seams on it. And in fact, they mentioned no type of external apparatus for sensing different types of information, which is very apparent on many of the Soviet space probes. Documents from both the U.S. Space Command and the Naval Surveillance Center verify the fact that Cosmos 96 did re-enter the Earth's atmosphere at about 3:18 in the morning in Canada.
And yet, without the object itself, there can be no final proof. Is it possible that it still might be held in some military storage facility? And if so, where? We've already learned of one attempt to trace the object's recovery and how that search led to a dead end.
The Russian embassy indicated the fact that they had no knowledge that Cosmos 96 or any other Soviet device had crashed in Pennsylvania on December 9th of 1965. Information obtained from the United States government indicates the fact that we had no re-entry of any American space debris or any type of weapon systems that could account for the crash at Kecksburg on that day. The official document obtained from the U.S. Air Force's Project Blue Book, which was their UFO investigation program, stated that the object which was involved with the Kecksburg incident was a meteor that had been observed over a large area.
All I can say about that is the people that are saying this are lying.
When we look at all the explanations for what we have concerning the Kecksburg incident, I believe we can roll out a hoax, we can roll out the incident involving an airplane crash, so we have to look at what possibilities still exist.
Oh, I think it was a UFO.
And our most likely explanations would be that we're dealing with either a man-made space probe.
Like nothing we've ever seen in this world.
So you're
Very
saying
different.
definitely this is an alien ship?
Yeah. Yes.
Oh yeah, definitely. From someplace other than here.
If we can eliminate those possibilities, then we have to deal with the fact that we might be dealing with an actual extraterrestrial spacecraft. Investigation to the incident at Kecksburg continues. And until we have more information, this is only speculation as to what the object might really be. Something did indeed fall from the sky that day in December of 1965 into the Kecksburg woods. The military responded very quickly, located the object and recovered it and took it away from the site.
So until someone comes forward with irrefutable proof of what fell to Earth on December 9th, 1965, the incident at Kecksburg may forever remain one of the unexplained events of the UFO Diaries.